it is my great pleasure to welcome all of you to this second call on how to realign our societies and economies for a time after the ongoing pandemic. And in this session today, we will look at the very interesting sphere of digitalization and the handling of our data, and how that sphere can be arranged in a way that's not just about consumer rights, but actually puts people and citizens at its center. And we'll especially focus on the urban area and on cities, and we'll, I think, talk a little bit about the buzzword that is the so-called smart cities. And I'm absolutely thrilled to have our next guest share with us her vision and vast experience on that topic. And it is my greatest pleasure and honor to welcome our next guest, Francesca Bria. Francesca Bria is currently the president of the Italian Innovation Fund, but before she was the Chief Technology and Innovation Officer for the city of Barcelona and an advisor on the future Internet innovation policy to the European Commission. And Francesca Bria is no doubt one of Europe's most leading digital policy experts, and we are absolutely thrilled to have her with us today. Welcome, Francesca.
Hello, hi, it's great to be here. Hi.
Great to have you. And the conversation with Francesca Bria will be moderated by Deepti Parchur. She is a senior researcher at IT for Change. She contributes to policy research in the areas of data economy, platforms and digital exclusions, and digital citizenship. She also manages the alternative media platform Bot Populi. I want to hand it over to you, Deepti and Francesca, and I'm really looking forward to this session.
Thank you, Ole. I'll jump right to it. I guess I want to start with, because it's been a year since COVID, and a lot of people have thought about this as like a moment in time which can, sort of either lead us down new pathways or sort of like, propel a lot of the status quo. So I guess in your view, I would want to ask, what about the COVID moment do you think is a catalyst for positive change, especially when we think about like urbanism and urban renewal? What lessons could we take for, trying to work with data-driven approaches for better city planning? What do you think about this particular moment in time and what it can teach us, or what it can sort of tell us about how to take forward? I think many of the very fascinating experiments that you've been part of as the architect of Decidem Barcelona. So I guess I'll start with that question, if that's all right, Francesca.
Yes, I think I will give you maybe a more complex answer in a sense, because obviously on one side, the crisis that we're living, which obviously is not only a healthcare crisis, but also an economic and social crisis. And we are seeing a very strong link between the climate crisis and the pandemic as well, and the loss of biodiversity, and even, increasing pollution in our cities. It's pushing us to look for forward-looking alternatives that will not bring us back to the status quo, but in fact bring us forward towards the more climate neutral, inclusive, green, and let's say also digital, but democratically digital society. So I think we can use this momentum to really foster more social imagination, to make sure that also communities that paid the crisis the most and the pandemic the most can be the ones that have more access to basic infrastructures and basic essential services, because obviously we don't have to forget that, for example, there are communities that are absolutely more vulnerable. Women have been paying more the crisis. And so we have to make sure that essential services and also digital infrastructures are seen as human rights for the majority of the population. So we have a lot of work to do that. On the other side, I think we've seen acceleration of digitization in society. because of the pandemic, because of the lockdown, because of social distancing. Definitely here in Europe, I'm not sure in many other countries, but we're seeing trends that are similar everywhere. All of a sudden, digitization was not something for digital experts or for technology experts, but it started really getting into our daily life. So changing the way we work with the so-called smart working or working from home, distance education that is, been a challenge for many communities around the world that didn't have access to connectivity, but also that didn't have the skills and the type of digital skills and capacity to really move to digital education. And beyond that, we've seen an increasing use of digital tools to track the pandemics, also digital healthcare tools, so application like contact tracing application, the use of monitoring with data, the entire population in order to better monitor the pandemic, and also increased, of course, use of digital tools in general, video conferencing, e-commerce, food delivery, the gig economy, let's say, had a boom. In this kind of acceleration, I think it became clear to all of us that accelerating digitization is not enough. We have to give digitization a direction. And this direction should mean that digitization should be put at the service of a green and ecological transition, but also that should be managed in a more democratic and inclusive way. And why do I say this? Because we are also seeing increasing concentration of market power, increasing concentration of wealth in the hands of very few companies. Mostly, this pandemic has been an economic shock for many companies and many industries around the world, but for big tech, for example, as for, of course, the pharma, but that's because mainly of the vaccine, big tech had a positive shock out of this pandemic. So we've seen the shares of tech companies skyrocketing, and now the big GAFAM from the US and also the Chinese platforms have a combined market value of over 8 to 9 trillion US dollars. So you can see that there is a very big question of how do we see the future of the digital economy? Does this mean that we're going to have a very concentrated market power, that the wealth that we can create through digitization and through the new digital industrial revolution will be in the hands of 5 to 7 big tech companies in the world, or are we able to redistribute this wealth across the entire population and also across the world, because we see lots of divides which persist in this digitization process. And these are divides that are territorial divides between the global north and the global south, but also between Northern Europe and Southern Europe within cities. We have a lot of divides, and of course we have socioeconomic divides, we have gender divides, and a divide which is at the very core of this, which is about skills and education in general, so investment in basic skills and education. So I think we have a very big opportunity still to make sure that this double imperative, let's say, of a digital transition that's democratic, that preserve fundamental rights of citizens, that put citizen participation and their rights, but also the protection of data, the protection of the environment at the very center. And the ecological transition, which is basically an economic imperative, because we cannot, climate change is just devastating. The impact of climate change is devastating, and we need to decarbonize our industries. We need to make our cities greener and cleaner. We need to change mobility, the way we produce, the way we consume, and also the way we build cities, in fact, the type of materials we use, the value chain. So we have a big transformation. These two transformation, the digital and the green one, I think they can go hand in hand, but in particular, we can do it putting forward a vision of the future that's definitely more based on solidarity, inclusion, and combating those divides. So we cannot accelerate inequalities but we want to accelerate those two transitions, but diminishing inequalities, and also making sure that really all of us can benefit from this transformation.
Your very successful experience with Barcelona has shown us that an assertion of techno sovereignty, coming from an urban governance standpoint is very much possible. So keeping in mind these ideas, these visions for the future, right? The idea of a digital transformation, the idea of ecological transition. How do you see, community rights of people over data being instrumental in being able to realize these visions, right? How can data governance or particular approaches to data respond to these challenges that, we need innovation which is very much local, we need innovation that's very much city driven, and we need innovation that's outside of the capture of big tech, that you so, elegantly talked about. So I would just like to know a little more about what you think can be ways to ensure sovereignty of resources, of technological resources, of digital infrastructure, of people over,
Yes, I definitely think that digital sovereignty as a topic is becoming more and more central to the policy agenda, to the political agenda, which is a very good thing, because we saw that it has an impact, as I said before, on market power and economic concentration, but also on industrial policy, on geopolitics, on national security, and on questions around democracy, privacy, fundamental rights. So it is becoming more and more important, and we understand that when we speak about digital sovereignty, we also mean political and economic sovereignty with a new geopolitical dimension. And this is becoming clear, I think, only recently. Having said that, I think if we want to pursue a transformative agenda when it comes to digital, there are a few steps that we can make. First of all, I think we should abandon the idea of technological determinism or techno-solutionism. So we should move away from this kind of mindset and this ideology that tells us that, we have complex challenges in the world, like the ones we have been discussing, public health care, transforming mobility, the fight against climate change, transitioning towards a greener economy, participatory democracy, all of these, and you can just solve it by using more technology or clicking somewhere. So this is obviously a mindset that's very disturbing, because we know that if we fall into that technological solutionism, let's just build an app, let's just do something technology, instead of understanding that first, you tackle the big social, environmental, and economic problems also in the urban environment, in cities, and only after you can think about what kind of technology and how to govern the technology. So how can you govern technology in a more democratic way in order to leverage the power of digital technologies and the power of the collective intelligence of people? Because that's a very fundamental point, I would say, that if we want to think digitally in a new way, we have to start from people's participation, from citizens' participation. So we have to put forward a new idea of participatory democracy, which I don't think, it doesn't have to challenge, for instance, in a so disruptive way, representative democracy, but definitely it's going in the direction of expanding the power that communities and people have, also with integrating the collective intelligence of community into the decision-making process. So we need to make people more able to really take part, to decide, not only once every 5 years when they go to vote. And the process has to be transparent. And also, I think we want to reshape the relationship between people, citizens, and the public institutions. So this is a very central point. Then, having said that, going to the question of data sovereignty, I think that this data sovereignty is the model that we have to build. Data democracy is what we need in our time. I think it's one of the defining political questions of our present and future, which is basically an alternative to what we are seeing for the digital future. I think that we usually are put forward a binary choice in our digital future. Either you have the big tech Silicon Valley model, which is what Shoshana Zuboff defines surveillance capitalism, where you have just around 5 big tech companies that manage all the tech infrastructure that we use, from hardware to data to the cloud to the quantum computing now to artificial intelligence, and then they use data as a raw material of the digital economy. It's mining, the information and data we produce, and then manipulating and monetizing data as the core of the business model. So this is the critique that Shoshana Zuboff makes of surveillance capitalism. And on the other side, I think we are seeing another emerging model, which I've been calling the big state. So big tech on one side and the big state on the other side, which is a little bit like the Chinese, more digital authoritarian model, where you have a very strong concentration of data and power in a centralized way. So it's hard to question, for example, the use of surveillance cameras, the use of facial recognition software everywhere. The data is just assembled and concentrated, and is used, I guess, with, let's say, in a way that doesn't presuppose a democratic right to data. So I think that we have a third way, and this third way, I've been defining it as big democracy. And I've been, of course, pushing for Europe to step forward to propose this third way, but this doesn't have to be a European only or European centric agenda, meaning that I would like to see it as a global agenda, in fact, creating also alliances with global South countries and with whoever cities and communities are realizing this model. And this is, of course, betting on a digital humanism, let's say, that put the fundamental rights of people, the right to privacy, the right to encryption as a human right, the right to control our data and decide what data we want to keep private, what data we want to share, with whom we want to share with data, and on what terms. So to create a kind of transparency, but also to conceive data, to rethink the ownership model of data, to consider data as an infrastructure for the public good, what I've been calling data commons, which doesn't only mean preserving privacy, it means preserving privacy and rights in order to foster a culture of data sharing and democratization of data, because obviously data can create a lot of public value. We can use data to create better services, to decarbonize our cities, for participatory democracy, to measure, CO2 pollution, to track the vaccine and the pandemic. I mean, we need to have access to this collective production of data and leverage data for the public interest, for the public good. So I guess this is the alternative that should be built, and creating also more decentralized data infrastructures, which are privacy enhancing and rights preserving. And there are many examples in cities, as the Barcelona case with Decode and other projects that we've been prototyped and scaled. We have participatory democracy examples, for example, with DCD in Barcelona. As you know now, the platform, it's used at a European level for the Conference on the Future of Europe. So there are going to be, there are now thousands, hundreds, thousands of citizens that are using it, and hopefully even more, arriving to millions. So it is possible to build open source, decentralized, privacy enhancing and rights preserving technology, which serve a kind of public good purpose. And this is where data is really important. This is where we have to make those changes. And I hope those changes can come from the ground up, from cities and citizens, but then be scaled up at a European and global level.
What relevance do you see? I mean, these ideas of big democracy and the ideas of, I think, what's grown out of the Barcelona initiative. Where do you see, how far do you see their relevance extending to cities of the global south? Because there are certain differences in political contexts, as well as capacities, as well as, I think, a varying cultural context.
Absolutely. No, it's a great question. And in fact, I don't want all the time, because we are pushing very much Europe to become a kind of role model in privacy and antitrust and data democracy and citizen participation, but it doesn't want to be an agenda that's Eurocentric and only applies to Europe. I think the best answer is that, first of all, it exists a UN-backed coalition, which is called the Cities Coalition for Digital Rights, that you should check, because there are almost 100 cities that are part of this coalition. And some of them, I mean, many actually, but not too many. We need more, are from the global south, from South America, from Asia, from there are some in Africa as well. And so they are participating. And obviously it is very important that the challenges that cities are facing are very different, but sometimes, you know, we have kind of common problems, and also we can together build common projects and common solutions that can be adapted, in particular if you're using this collaborative, open and transparent approach that I'm suggesting, like using open source software and using, you know, data commons and so on. It's much easier to replicate and to share. If we do something somewhere, it can be picked up and adapted to the local reality. But what I really want to put forward and strengthen in my introduction is that it's very important not to start from the technology. So actually, I think that in the global south, the digital sovereignty is absolutely critical, because you need those infrastructures and those collective intelligence of the communities in order to tackle the problems that, I mean, the living condition of people, improve the living condition of people, improve access to healthcare, improve better housing for people, affordable housing, fight climate change, improve the participation of the communities. Those are the issues. So we should not start from, you know, just the 5G or the connectivity, the data, the blockchain. We should start from framing right the problem and getting the right community. For whom are we building smart cities? Smart for whom? And who is owning the data? How can we redistribute? How can we create public value? I think those are the important questions for me. And then we get a better knowledge about building technologies actually where we are. So if you're from India, building it there, empowering, you know, your research capacity, your technology talent, your startups, your NGOs, you know, everybody has the capacity to build technologies that is tailored to solving local problems, but also with principle and values that apply to a community, which also means, you know, paying taxes, protecting workers' rights, protecting the environment, and protecting data and the fundamental rights of citizens.
Thank you so much, Francesca. We did get a question, but I think I wanted you, since you said you were on a tight timeline. So I want to thank you again for your time. Thank you for the fascinating responses. I think you've given our audience a lot to think about. And yeah, thank you again. Ole, anything you'd like to add?
Just thank you very much for being here. Thank you for taking the time. It was a pleasure having you. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye. Thank you.
All right. Okay. I think that was a wonderful start into this conversation. Unfortunately, Francesca has to run, but we have Deepti here still with us. And maybe to continue this conversation, why don't could you expand on the last thought that Francesca that just talked about? You know, what does this mean for the global south when we talk about these data solutions and the smart city approach? Maybe you can expand on that a little bit.
Certainly, thanks. And I also just want to, I think, in my response, I think, even though a bit tangentially, address the question that was raised in the chat about like the emphasis on techno-solutionism and where it leads us. I just wanted to, I think, place one stat, which I thought was quite interesting, that currently the smart city industry, as in the business, is worth about 410 billion US dollars. And by 2025, it's poised to grow to $820 billion. And this is, of course, helmed very largely by enterprise service companies such as Cisco, IBM, and Microsoft. So I just wanted to, I guess, preface that, you know, because I think I echo Francesca's sentiment very strongly when we think about smart cities. I think there's a need to move away from that fetishism about like what that means, this top-down idea of like what a smart city, which is essentially inviting a lot of large companies to come and build smart energy grids, or like have a sensor-ridden like walkway, or like have like, you know, smart water meters that you can turn on and turn off through your apps or anything like that, because of course those things are important. I'm not making an argument that they're not. But I think in the global south, urban problems tend to be very different. A lot of urban cities actually do suffer from, I mean, a lot of urban cities in the global south do suffer from systemic issues that, still need a lot of attention at, like, pre-digital level. Like there's a lot of deficits in planning, there's a lot of deficits in like how cities are planned, how resources are allocated, how different agencies work together. And this is not to suggest that, that hence they're not deserving of smart city solutions or anything like that. I think the context must therefore define the solution, and I'm a big believer in that. But what we're seeing more and more is these kind of, because there is a large interest in a lot of bureaucracy and a lot of, I think, policymakers to adopt smart city solutions because you think it's a fix-it, that it can just come in and it can transform your city and take away all of its existing problems, which can never really happen because you haven't really addressed the root cause of these. And so they create a lot of these, like, special vehicles, they create a lot of these vision plans, they invite a lot of these companies on board. And I can tell you just from my, I think, knowledge of how far the smart city progress has happened in India, not very much. There hasn't been, it's been on for about 6 years, 7 years now. Not a lot has happened on ground with any of that. And that's because these are fundamentally visions that have failed to couple with the on-ground issues. And also they have failed to, I think, couple with what Francesca said, which is really about the participatory process. We have a very strong constitutional mechanism, which is under the Indian Constitution, which allows for very strong mechanisms of urban governance where people can be engaged, citizens can come to meetings, you can table propositions, you can debate over it, etc. Of course, its efficiency has been somewhat mixed, I would say, definitely. But the fact is that none of these smart city plans are really able to talk to this at all. And that's a tragedy because it's a lost opportunity, because you're essentially then just bringing in a techno-solutionism layer that doesn't really address that at all. So I think for any smart city or any data-driven approach within urban governance to work, I think we need to, like Francesca said, center the democracy question first, then bring in the data. And the data has to, of course, also be governed by democratic principles. And you need like local ownership over resources. You need like enterprises that are built in the country, in the city. You need like a lot of local engagement. And that's what will really be transformative. So yeah, that's, I guess, a short answer to that question.
Yeah, thank you, Diti. That was really fascinating. Could you maybe expand a little bit more on what that could look like? Do you have an idea how we could tackle such a task?
I mean, not so much of an idea, but I guess an illustration that we were trying to work on as part with my organization. We tried to do a pilot in Bangalore, which is where I'm from, which is, of course, a very large city. It's a very well-known IT hub. It's a place where a lot of Silicon Valley companies and also a lot of domestic startups are there. But it also suffers from a lot of urban planning issues. So we worked with this geography of 1,000 households. It was just a small 2-year project that we did where this was a neighborhood that was basically a denotified area, in the sense that its legibility in the governance system is questionable. Like there are a lot of these kinds of land areas within cities that tend to have these problems. They're not properly recognized, so they don't have official water channels, they don't have official sort of like electricity inputs. They're not even mapped. If you went on Google Maps and you tried to find, the road stops actually when you start to enter the neighborhood. So we did this process with the young people there, where we, over a series of like 2 years, we worked with them to actually geospatially map the entire area, like look at the different civic communities that are available within that. And there was an outstanding problem of drinking water supply, which we tried to use this database, which was completely community built for the community. It wasn't an open data set because there was a relevance to the community, hence it was sort of like kept within the community. So we did this entire data set, and then we were able to link it back to the city's water board. And we were able to connect that in terms of like actually have a grievance redressal system that runs back to the city's official channels, so that any complaint that I uploaded here for a house saying, there's a lack of drinking water supply could like go back and, actually reach the official channels. Unfortunately, we had to put it on hiatus because in the last few months, because of the pandemic, so we haven't been able to restart the work. But it was an interesting experiment in sort of like allowing us to think about the possibilities of data that's actually community built. Like, what can that help us do? So it gave us some insights in terms of that. So I think that's one example that I have. But there are numerous, I think, small initiatives that people are always doing. And I think there are a lot of examples for us to learn from. I think especially indigenous data rights management, for example, like there are a lot of interesting things that have come up in the scholarship and the discourse in the past few years about how the governance of common resources such as land, water, etc., can tell us a lot about how we should be managing data in community and public interest. And I think those are great places for us to look at, because these are knowledge systems that are old. They're very rooted in, like, I think, specific cultural and local contexts. And so they have a lot to tell us. And I think we should be looking at these also in terms of like how we actually develop policies around data governance for local innovation, local use, and local interest. So yeah.
How would you describe the current moment, this pandemic, this disruption? How would you say, do we move out of this? Is this a moment where we can use for positive change in the ways that you just described, or do you fear that we're actually falling back a few steps because the digitalization has kind of taken over our lives without these democratizing elements and community elements in place already?
I think the verdict is a bit mixed. I think a lot of what has happened in the past year does give us a lot of cause for concern. I think just to, in terms of like what I think Francesca meant about the big state, there has been a lot of, I think, excuse for excess. I'll put it that way. I think that like the pandemic and the need for, I guess, certain kinds of data tracing mechanisms, like, contact tracing tools and apps. I think there are also specific legislations around epidemics and pandemics that allow states to sometimes, I think, compromise civil liberties, which are understandable in certain contexts and also not. So we've seen, I think, the rollout of these kinds of overtures a lot. I think more than 36. So it's, I think it was in April that we did a small. I was working on some research, and something about 40 countries had like already put in place like some kind of contact tracing mechanisms, and like with very, very questionable laws and norms and rules around like what will the data be collected for, what's its purpose limitation, how will it be used after the purpose has been served, and all of those things. So I think it gives me pause because I think there has been a lot that's been lost in the moment of the pandemic. But I also think that some things that it does is that it highlights what doesn't work. Like Francesca said, I think it completely highlights the fact that our current systems are so completely incapable of actually handling disasters of this level, that the withdrawal of the social systems and the social safety net, systematically, that has happened over many years has had very damaging consequences. So that gives me hope in the sense that there is a moment of reckoning, that states are able to understand that there is great value in actually revitalizing public infrastructure, and data and digital are part of this. Definitely, I don't see them as like exceptions or something else. I think they're as vital as any other kinds of public infrastructure. So I think definitely there is room, but I also would like caution about the ways in which I think the pandemic has allowed a lot of states to play very fast and loose with civil liberties, the role of data within that. So it's a tightrope, I think, that needs to be balanced very, very carefully. But definitely, I think it's a moment of reckoning, and it allows us to imagine different possibilities, because it very clearly highlights all the things that don't work about our current system. So
one of our audience members, Hatice Zehra, sent me a message in the chat with a question on AI.
okay.
In this context, Sarah, do you want to post the question yourself? And can we maybe get your video for that? I don't see you right now. Maybe you post a question into the chat for everyone to see, then our moderator can put you on the screen. Oh, I see. Okay, she can't unmute herself, so I'll just ask her question for her.
I can unmute
so she
her,
asked
but
about,
I cannot see her.
Okay, yeah, I think she has technical difficulties. So let me just try to see if I can ask that question for her. And she asked, how do you think AI and specifically its usage for big data will affect the global sphere, as in global governance and on that level? Do you have a view on that, deeply?
Some views, not a lot. This is, I mean, an idea that I'm still learning a bit. So, you know, I'm still forming my opinions. I think AI itself is actually a matter of global governance. I think I would invert the question. It's not so much about what AI can do for global governance, because it's very much a general purpose paradigm. It's something like electricity or water, which is likely to have, like, you know, applications and utilities in a lot of different sectors. So we will see some form of like AI specific regulation across sectors. And I think that's already coming in. Like, you know, if you look at something like connected car systems or IoT data and how we're being able to manage what happens in like automated cars, or, you know, we think about how a lot of thought, and rightfully so, is going into thinking about cyber weaponry, right? The idea that we actually may need to update our conventions around like warfare and like how we think about AI-led cyber warfare in the future, which is like an important thing. We're starting to see discourses around systemic bias, and how we need to have ways to not just peer back into the black box, but also demand various kinds of accountability. That AI needs to be built on robust data systems. So we're seeing like a lot of different, I think it's definitely going to be something very cross-sectoral. But beyond that, I think global governance actually has a duty and a mandate to take on the governance of AI in global and like public interest. Like we've had human rights instruments that, you know, sort of came up after the post-Second World War in terms of like being able to address a new idea of international consciousness. I definitely think that AI and data are matters of global governance interest that should be treated by forums as such, that they need to be treated as actually, you know, in terms of not just their development outcomes, like what they could have, and that's development outcomes of individuals, communities, as well as nation states, but also in terms of their human rights outcomes. So that's just a short answer, but I still think about these things a little more in terms of all the things that you could think about AI being like an object of governance. I think the possibilities are limitless, but I think AI in itself needs to actually be like a subject of global governance. Definitely something that the UN system, the OECD, the G20, like all different forums need to be looking at with great interest.
Right, maybe sorry, didn't mean to interrupt that, but maybe to wrap this up, overall, are you more optimistic or more pessimistic that that big data, artificial intelligence, smart cities, all those buzzwords will be a benefit for our societies, or are you more skeptical of that? If you can give an outlook.
I tend to lean on the more optimistic. Because I think I just want to also, I guess, address the comment that I think Viewfinding had like put up about the fact that, you know, technology has been a driver of, you know, enormous social change, and we shouldn't forget that. I think there is a lot of like value that digital intelligence, AI, and, you know, data do bring to the table. But the question is, what's the framework within which we expropriate that value, whether we look at it as something that should be done in public interest, outside of like market frameworks, outside of profit frameworks, not to suggest that that's the only way that can happen. I think it's more about like, can we make room for like having those be like ways in which we actually develop these resources? Then definitely, I think there's a lot of benefits. I think, and I think I would really tend to be more on the optimistic side, I think.
All right. Thank you, Deepti. Thank you so much for being here, for joining us. This was very insightful, a fascinating conversation with Francesca, Bria as well. And I want to thank all of you, everyone in the audience who attended.